Thank you very, very much for coming. We really appreciate it. We put a lot of trouble into this paper and some trouble into this webinar, and I hope it's worth your while. We'll certainly try to make it so. I work on access to medicines out of Bangalore in India, where I'm joining you from. It's a rainy day today. I hope it doesn't rain too much. I'll have to shut the windows or you won't be able to hear. I'd like to start by taking you through a history of this paper. We began working on it 2018, so 1 year before the pandemic, when there was less attention on biologics and vaccines. We finished it after the pandemic because of all of the pressing concerns that we had to work on during the pandemic. And in a way, I'm glad that we did, because during the pandemic, when there were immediate day-to-day vaccine shortages, other drug shortages, it was very, very difficult to think of harder, more long-term solutions, more structural changes that could be made in the economy and in the political economy of pharmaceutical production. The kinds of questions that we've raised in this paper, and that we hope now there is a more welcoming environment to discuss, given that we have the luxury of time and not being in a pandemic. We examined two systems of monopolies in this paper, intellectual property and drug regulation. This seminar will focus exclusively on the intellectual property monopolies, because we found that the subject nature of the paper is too vast to encompass all in one go. In order to aid the understanding of it and help us to delve deep into these issues, these two separate issues, we decided to split those up. This is the first of two webinars we'll organize. The data and analysis is based on the Indian experience, but as you will see from our guest speakers in this webinar and beyond, the lessons are universal. So what happens in India is a microcosm of what's happening more or less anywhere else in the developing world, and to a certain extent in the developed world as well. A quick note on terminology. The title of this webinar uses the phrase biologics and vaccines. Effectively, however, in the scientific terminology, biologics is a category that includes vaccines, and that's how the paper handles it. We'll probably just use the word biologics by and large, because it encompasses vaccines. We separate them sometimes by saying non-vaccine biologics and vaccine biologics. In popular usage, we use those two words distinctly, biologics referring to things like monoclonal antibodies, for instance, and vaccines referring to things that we took during COVID. I'll summarize the findings of this paper and the recommendations of this paper, and then hand it over to my co-authors to say more about it, and then to our invited guests to talk about it. There are three essential findings around intellectual property that we think it's worth your while to know. The first is that biologics patents are really hard to identify. It's for a few reasons. The patent estates are vast, and they are not exclusively the domain of the developer or the company that brings it to market. So for instance, with the COVID vaccines, yes, Moderna owns a chunk of the intellectual property around Moderna's COVID vaccine, but there have been multiple other claimants to different component parts of the vaccine. So Arbutus and Genevant, for instance, have lawsuits that are around the lipid nanoparticle component of the Moderna vaccine. There are multiple other licenses, sub-licenses, cross-licenses from technologies that are not easily identifiable as being a part of that larger biological pharmaceutical. And so either at the core or the periphery, the patent estates of these biologics are incredibly hard to identify. The second finding is that biologics patents are even harder to examine. And this is primarily because most countries in their patent laws and in their patent offices still treat biologics as a kind of frontier technology, even though that time has long passed. The widespread use of biologics, especially vaccines, over the last 3 years has meant that this is not the future, it's the present, and in fact, it's our past. And yet what happens is that we don't have in India, or as you will hear in other countries as well across the developing world, sufficiently developed guidelines, patent examination guidelines, manuals, in order to be able to translate the principles that are encoded in national patent laws to the examination of biologics. The third finding is that it's very hard to override these patent monopolies because we can't identify them. They are hard to examine and often misinterpreted in terms of the decision to accept or to reject them. And it means that typically the laws that are required to override these monopolies have to allow for a product-based or a platform-based compulsory licensing regime, which is absent in most developing country legislations, indeed in most legislations around the world. The solutions that we suggest as a result of these findings are to have better categories for identifying biologics patents, both internationally at WIPO as well as nationally, in order that we might be able to be better and faster identify them in order to know what they are. The second is to create patent examination guidelines that genuinely work, that use the principles in patent law that are either in the law or interpreted by the courts and extend them towards biologics, so that the situation that exists today, where sometimes biologics patents come in and the patent office views them as though they're written in a foreign language, maybe from another planet, can be avoided. And patent examiners who are working in good faith actually have a clear set of instructions that they can use to bridge the gap, a very vast gap, between what the patent law and practice suggests and what they should do with a particular biologics patent application. The third, which is incredibly important, I suppose, especially in light of the pandemic, is what to do with compulsory licensing. How do we override them? And our suggested solutions here are, one, that government use must sometimes be not only clarified, but also put into use. So for instance, in India and South Africa right now, in theory, governments could apply government use to take over patents on a product or a platform technology, such as messenger RNA technology. But the truth is they've never actually used it. And so we don't fully know whether that power actually exists. Certainly what we do know in both India and South Africa is that the compulsory licensing laws don't allow for it. They explicitly require patent applications to be listed. When you're trying to override monopolies in a situation where you cannot, it is physically and literally impossible to identify comprehensively the patent estate around a biologic, you need to have some kind of legislative framework that allows for product-based compulsory licensing. And in its absence, there isn't a clear legal solution, either in India or South Africa, and definitely so in Brazil as well, which you'll hear of, which has a little more ambiguity, to, even in the instance that a government backs or that courts back civil society and patient groups, their desire to override the patent estates on a particular biologic or a vaccine, we find that the legal power to effect that override doesn't actually exist, and that's something that should concern us. Thank you. I'm now going to turn it over to two of my co-authors who are here with us today. Two out of several co-authors, some of whom couldn't be here with us today, some of whom also, I suppose, I should just say we couldn't name because the time that it took to complete this paper meant that they had switched jobs and are now working in the private sector, and then couldn't be identified with something as seemingly radical as this paper. The first person who will go is Roshan John. Roshan is a lawyer who works on intellectual properties around access to medicines in Delhi. Welcome, Roshan, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Achal, and thanks a lot for the introduction. I'll just quickly try to share my screen and have a quick short presentation. Yeah, thank you. So I'll mostly be speaking on the data collection part and how we started working on this paper and the challenges we faced throughout the analysis and the data collection of it, because most of the entire report is kind of based on a lot of patent applications and how both for the rejected and the grant thing. So as Achal mentioned that we started working on this paper around 2018, and we wanted to look on how biologic patent applications were examined at the patent office. But it was a Herculean task because of several reasons, and including that there are around 50,000 patent applications that are filed in India in a year, and which is an enormous amount of application. And there were several, and the rejected and the granted patent applications in the patent office website is not that easily accessible. We could only have access to those application easily if you already know the number. So in order to have an empirical research done at this scale, it required us to have all the data available, which was not the case in this case. In this case, further, as Achal already mentioned, that there was no category of biologics per se at the IPO. The IPO categorizes their applications in several manners, which included biotechnology, microbiology, mechanical patents, or engineering related patents, and so on. But there was no separate category of biologics per se, which would make it easier for us to look at those applications and see how those applications were examined. This was the case also for internationally filed application through the PCT system. There were no IPC codes corresponding to biologic patents per se, like that was in the case of our earlier report on pharmaceutical grants, where it was relatively easy to identify international patent classification codes relating to pharmaceutical small molecules or pharmaceutical patents. So the entire process kind of took almost a year to collect and refine the data for further analysis, which, as Achal mentioned, there were several people, several experts in the field who then took a look at these applications and analyze the information. So quickly on the methodology, as I mentioned, that it was difficult to scrape data on the reject and grants in a similar fashion. So we used two separate methodologies for analyzing rejects and a separate methodology for analyzing grants because of the variability in accessing these patent applications on the patent office website. So for rejected, to have an understanding of the rejected patent application, there is a database of the Indian Patent Office which looks at dynamic patent utilities, which has a stream-wise categorization of patent application, which had 23 different streams. It has information from 2012 to 2012, and since we started this work in 2018, so we looked at information from 2012 to 2018. However, we understand this was not very comprehensive, but this was the only solution to know what all applications were rejected by the patent office. So we filtered, once we had a list of applications from this particular database, we filter our results on the basis of 4 categories, which were closest to biologic, that we thought is biotechnology, biochemistry, biomedical engineering, and microbiology. And further, on the basis of medicine-related IPC code, we further filtered down the results. And then we looked at each and every application and classified them manually as biologics by reading their description, by reading their abstract, by reading the claims, to see whether that fits under the broader definition of biologics that we have mentioned in the paper. So we finally analyzed around 275 applications from using this method. For granted application, as I mentioned, that we didn't rely on the earlier database, but we used a public search function of the IPO, which had the option to list out all the granted patents which were granted by the patent office. So we used 2012 to 2018 and came out with 12,000 granted patent applications, which we then filtered out all the fields of inventions which were not relevant for our analysis, which included things like agriculture or engineering, mechanical, and so on. So once we removed all the fields of invention which were not relevant, we again ran the IPC codes which were closest to biologics, which were 4 to 8 IPC codes, which we thought were the closest to biologics and which were used to filter these results further. Once we had a broader list of applications, which was substantially less than the 12,000 earlier application, we then read all the application and manually classified whether this particular application is a biologic according to our definition or not. No, so after going through all the applications, it was we kind of did two levels of analysis. That is, one is on the broader aspect, and another on specifically reading on different types of subcategories under biologics. So when we did the broader analysis, we then further subcategorized all the biologics into different categories. That is antibody, which Ramya would be speaking about, cells, peptides, proteins, sugar, vaccines, virus, and among other things. For the purposes of our report, we focused on antibodies, peptides, and proteins, and vaccines, which you will find on the report a broader, deeper analysis on this. But the overarching challenges, as Achal already mentioned, that the biologics are that we face several challenges in identifying as well as classifying biologics, because biologics are often composed of multiple components, and each component is unique in their own way, and each component might have a separate pattern on it, and it's very difficult to classify even if you see in the IPO, in the patent office, and even internationally used IPC codes, the classification are varied. There won't be something called a biologic. It falls under various categories. As I mentioned, it can fall under biotechnology, microbiology. We even found things under engineering which we thought was biologic, but it was categorized wrongly by the patent office. So that took a lot of manual reading through the claims, reading through the descriptions to come at a decision that this is biologic for the purposes of our report. So now all these multiple components, as I said, have multiple patterns on each of the component, and it was very difficult to determine what would be the full scope of a particular pattern. It was so difficult that from even if we had identified a particular patent application that it relates to a biologic, it was difficult to classify that particular patent application into what product it would end up being in. So the challenges in identifying a particular biologic and what product it relates to was itself an enormous task. If you see, I've put a sorry, I've put
Roshan,
an example.
Roshan, sorry to interrupt for a second. Just to keep the time, may I ask that we'll wrap this up in a few seconds? Yeah.
Sure. I've just done. I've quickly done. So if you see on the slide, there is it's in the case of vaccine development. If you see, there are four different categories, from starting materials, vaccine composition, process technology, method of use. All these categories have different patents filed in different stages of the process. Now, quickly on the final thing that what we have noticed, that, as Achal have already mentioned, about the lack of comprehensive guidelines in the patent office has has resulted in differential examinations for different applications. We have seen that there is the patent office in India has used Section 3, which is used for differentiating primary and secondary patent application. But because of the lack of secondary application, we have seen cases across different subcategories that the Section 3 is used in varied nature. For one particular application, Section 3 was used. For another similar application, Section 3 was not used. That is, we mainly attribute it to because of the lack of guidelines. In India, we do have a biotechnology guidelines, but because of the fact that biologics may not solely be limited to biotechnology category, which was categorized by the IPO. It was used differentially. So having a comprehensive guidelines, we feel that this issue might be could be resolved. Yes, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Roshan. Sorry, we're going to be slightly late on time. Our next speaker is also a co-author of this paper. Ramya Sheshadri is a patent agent who works on access to medicines and also manages the Indian Patent Opposition Database. And she joins us from Bangalore in India, where I am as well. Welcome, Ramya. And just a quick reminder, if we can keep it to about 5 or 6 minutes so that we can get everyone in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can't see you though necessarily. I don't know why.
So the reason I'm not able to start the video, it says the host has stopped.
Just a minute.
Start
just a minute. Yeah, 1 minute. 1 minute. Yeah, you can do it now.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm visible, I assume. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I have a very limited time. So basically, we have different parts in the paper, and I'm basically going to talk about antibodies. So antibodies, as we all know, it's already a naturally available substance in every living body. So basically, it's produced in response to in our immune system. So we are focusing on monoclonal antibodies, and monoclonal antibodies are something which, when they are mass produced in a laboratory and by adopting various technologies. So antibody also falls under one of the biologics category. And as we know, monoclonal antibodies have been used extensively for the past decade or so in medical field. It's been the go-to wonder drug for most of the ailments in the current situation. And with the development of antibody, we have also seen that the need to protect every aspect of the antibody by the innovator companies has been really strong. We have seen a lot of patents being, created across many known antibodies. Like, for example, we have for Humira, we have more than 100 patents, and then for Herceptin, up to 108 patents have been granted. This data is from United States, basically. And then even for Avastin, there are up to 86 patents granted. And to this day, the innovator companies continue to apply for patent on various aspects of the antibody, because a patent can be applied for the structure of the monoclonal antibody, for its functionality, for the source from where it is taken, and even for various uses. So only in today's newspaper I was looking that tolicitinib monoclonal antibody is now being explored for hair loss, alopecia and things. So multiple monoclonal antibodies have also been identified to show various uses, same antibody. And even during Corona, saw a lot of antibodies being approved for use. For example, Shield, Actamera, etc. So why I am emphasizing is because the future of medicine will definitely include a lot of antibodies and use of monoclonal antibodies. Now coming to our report, basically, generally, a patent is granted when the innovator is able to prove that the invention is new, it involves an inventive step, and is of industrial application. And when it comes to India, we have certain other grounds, such as under Section 3D, where biologics are also, every invention is also tested in terms of whether it falls under Section 3C, which basically says any mere discovery of a scientific principle or discovery of a living thing, known living thing, is not patentable, and then mere discovery of a new form or a new use of a known substance, section 3D. Then we have section 3, so a combination or composition of known compounds without any synergistic effect. When we say synergistic effect, it has to, the sum of all the compounds should come up with a different or a new effect. Only then that invention, specifically, this is more observed in pharmaceuticals and biologics, so section 3. And then we also have 3I, so any process which involves medical or surgical treatment. So to an extent, diagnostic claims are extensively filed. In biologics also we see extensive patent applications filed. So that is also tested under section 3I. And then 3J, wherein whole plants and animals can't be patented, excluding microorganisms. Here also there are certain grounds which has to be satisfied if the innovator company is trying to seek a patent protection on microorganisms. So what did we see in our report? So basically, like Roshan already highlighted, it was a huge challenge for us to categorize the biologics. Even under antibody, we saw that how, for example, we tried to understand under section 3D what kind of antibody would be considered as a new use or a new form of a known substance. So we had a couple of examples like an antibody which is being explored for liver cancer and diagnosis and treatment called anti-glypican antibody. Now this glypican 3 antibody is already known. So they came up with an anti-3 glypican antibody and they tried to apply for a patent. However, the patent office, objected to it, and they also rejected the patent on the ground of saying that it's a new form of a known substance. Because anti-glypican is known, the antibody is known, its functionality is known, so it is a new form of a known substance. And one more example we came across was new use of known substance. So basically, Humira is a drug we all know about, which is used for treatment of psoriasis. So the ABV biotechnology company, they had filed for, already they have patents. They further filed for a patent claiming the new use, basically erosive polyarthritis. They claimed a patent for use of Humira for erosive polyarthritis, but the patent office rejected the application saying that this is a new use of a known substance, so this can't be patented. So under each category, section 3D, 3E, 3C, we were able to identify patent applications which were rejected by the patent office. However, there were also many patent, because the grant of patents for biologics has been much higher than rejections. To give you one example, pertuzumab is a drug used for treatment of breast cancer. Though pertuzumab was known, and even after the patent office actually in their first examination report mentioned that this is already known, the applicant was able to overcome that argument in their submission, saying that we have added some extra sequences. Though the use of the drug pertuzumab was for treating breast cancer, because they came up with additional sequence and they were able to submit some data saying that this shows improved, therapeutic efficacy in treating breast cancer. And they also submitted data saying that this drug is already approved by regulatory bodies in many parts of the world. So you have to grant a patent. I mean, the use, its therapeutic efficacy is already established. So these kind of arguments were actually accepted by the patent office and the patent has been granted. So to conclude, as far as antibodies is concerned, what we also saw in the orders, one is a lack of guidelines. I mean, overall, there is a sense that there is lack of guidelines, be in terms of categorization of the biologics or in terms of how to examine a biologics given various components involved in the, because it's a large molecule, but also what we really think this whole biologics can be, the extensive patenting, evergreening practice can be curtailed in the patent office if the patent office really adopts very recent orders, because in all the decisions we came across, it is very unfortunate to see that the patent office had verbatim accepted whatever submissions was made by the applicant when patents were granted. And then we know that there are 4 different patent offices across India. So different patent office had different ways of analyzing the aspects. So, to conclude, we really think that the patent office, if they come out with a reasoning in terms of what kind of data is allowed, what kind of grounds are accepted or rejected while granting or rejecting a patent, that can give much more clarity and help in, disallowing too many patent applications which we see being filed for most of the biologics. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ramya. We're going to move quickly. I just want to say that we are almost certainly going to exceed our time, and I hope that some of you, at least, who are here with us today will bear with us and stay with us. We'll move to Brazil. We're very grateful to have 3 invited guests who bring different perspectives from the Brazilian, the South African, and the international arena. Ana Cláudia Oliveira is an IPFINA, and Ana Cláudia Oliveira is an IP specialist at ABIFINA and Progenericos, 2 leading consortia of API, vaccine, and drug manufacturers, and she joins us from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.
Good morning. I want to thank the authors for the invitation. I will share my screen with my presentation. I would like to explain why this work is so important, and also the difficulty, I guess, they had to develop this paper. In Brazil, the scenery is similar. Here I put some parts of the paper that show how we go through the same kind of situation here in Brazil. Patents for biological products are very spread out. We have a high number of documents. The guidelines to exam here in our office of patent office in Brazil, they also have to be updated. And the creation of this identification system may facilitate it. So we start showing how in Brazil we have the evergreening. Likewise, it has in other countries. We have the same difficulty of finding the corresponding patents. The patents that we find in FDA. This is an example of evergreening in bevacizumab, where the first American patent expired in 2011, and the last one in Brazil will expire in 2035. So we have 24 years of monopoly, and each one of those patents is directed to part of this technology. That's why it's so difficult to put together all the patents that cover a product. Recently, I did a comparative study for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, when I compare the law and guidelines and the exam guidelines of 42 countries. And we were able to see how we have so many patents and how different it is in each one of those countries. The basis for this comparative study were 4 papers. One of them, the one that is highlighted by this red arrow, presents a paper from the Brazilian Patent Office where the examiners have classified patents of biotechnology according to what they find here in Brazil. So this is a summary of those classifications. And we have here biotechnology. That is why this paper is so interesting, because it's focused on vaccines specifically and biological medication. Here in the Brazilian Patent Office, in this paper, they present the classification, and they show how patents, when they have their different phases in different countries, they receive different classifications. Some include devices, diagnostic kits, or biotechnological processes, or inputs, many things. And that's why it's so difficult to put together all those documents. In this study, we show the material that can be patented in biotechnology. And here I highlighted Brazil, India, and South Africa to show that they are similar countries in terms of matters for patent in biotechnology. These three countries are quite similar. Here we compare the Global Innovation Index according to WIPO with the matters that were patented. We see that India has an innovation level that is higher than Brazil and South Africa, but they are almost at an equilibrium between matters that were patent or not patent, and in terms of innovation in those three countries. Of course, there are other aspects to be considered also, especially the economics and the development stage of each one of those countries. In this graph, we show that according to how we include live beings isolated from nature, we see more and more restriction of different countries. And when it includes the human being, I mean, technologies that involve the human being, this increases even more. These restrictions increase. So the cloning process of human beings almost forbidden in all countries. So the proposal of a system that identifies biological and intellectual property products is very important for all those reasons I listed. The advantage is it will include all patents for biological products in one group. And the challenges are the complexity of working with a very large number of documents, which will not always generate products and reach the market. One of the suggestions I gave the authors was perhaps to have a list of priorities containing biological products that are already on the market that could be identified. And then you are able to identify in a reverse way. Also, to create effective examination guidelines or regulation extensive to biological products is very important, because biotechnology is an area that evolves very quickly. So those guidelines of biological products must be updated at least once a year to include new technologies and new possibilities of examination. Our guideline is from a normative instruction of 2020 that was reviewed after 2015. It only included more examples and further details, no new technologies. So we can say that this update comes since 2015. So it's more than time to update again this exam guideline here in Brazil. The expansion of terms of compulsory licensing the government use, according to Brazilian law, we have two types of license, voluntary as well as compulsory license. Brazil granted compulsory license for efavirenz in 2007, the retroviral drug from Merck, and the Brazilian government before this negotiation fought for a price reduction. But even though we are not able to reduce the price, and not including the same level of development in different countries, so we are not able to reduce the price. And even though it entered the watch list as a country that does not respect the rights of intellectual property. After this compulsory license, Brazil was kind of afraid of suggesting other compulsory licenses. Recently, we had this law 14200 that has modified Article 71 of our patent law in Brazil and put the onus on the government to present this list of patents that would protect a product that would be in the interest of license. So there is this definition that it is the government that should present this list of patents for those who are interested in licensing it. This would facilitate because the onus is to the government. They will have to deal with the patent holder, the owner of the reference product, and those who are interested in licensing the product. So this makes it easier. But this law, this change to the law was published because of the COVID pandemic. After the pandemic, the main objective of this law was to improve the possibility of compulsory licensing after epidemics. But in the words, it's written epidemics and public interest. So all the patents for biologicals protect patents that are for a treatment of severe and chronic diseases, where the cost from the Ministry of Health is very high. So there is a public interest, a social interest, and this could be questioned so that they could use this possibility offered in the law. So I try to be as quick as possible to facilitate the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. I, in the interest of time, will move right on. And our next speaker is from Johannesburg in South Africa. We welcome Candice Sehoma, who is the Access Campaign Advocacy Advisor at Médecins Sans Frontières, and she joins us from Joburg. Welcome, Candice.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So I'll be also quite brief. So I'll speak on a particular example in South Africa, which is the mRNA flood, which was established to address vaccine inequities experienced during COVID. And also just in light of the fact that in South Africa, there are several key patent laws in the medicines in the country. So one of them is, the patent applications are not subjected to a substantive examination before granting. And there's also a very flawed, patentability criteria. As a result, many low quality patents have been granted for life-saving medicine. For example, with the mRNA hub, very broad patent claims were granted to Moderna related to the mRNA vaccine technology that were rejected in other countries such as Japan, South Korea, and many other countries due to a lack of technical merit. At least 3 mRNA vaccine patents have been granted in South Africa to Moderna. These patents will only start expiring in 2034. These include 1 patent with very broad claims covering the method of production for an mRNA vaccine, and 1 with claims on the gene sequence of relevant to mRNA vaccine, and other containing broad claims on the method of delivering biologicals into cells that is useful for production. So currently, that's the 3 listed patents we know of at the time, currently, and also at the time when MSF developed a briefer just analyzing the patent blockage on mRNA technology in South Africa. and not really having being privy to other patents that might be filed in this regard, which might limit the full use of the technology. So despite the government commitment to implement patent examination procedures and the recruitment of patent examiners in South Africa, there's still no substantive examination happening. At the same time, the current legal framework is not adequate enough to provide a framework to scrutinize biologics, including vaccine. So basically, it's a double kind of difficulty to examine biologics because of inadequate frameworks, and that is even more difficult because we don't have any examination process, because there has been delays in reforming our current patent laws. And even in the issuance of a compulsory license, considering that it requires a listing of patents, you can't easily do so for a biologic or technology platform like the mRNA. As mentioned, in the case of mRNA, that we currently know of 3, and we might not be privy to further patents on the technology, which could potentially block the granting of a compulsory license on the technology platform. And that would require some additional inclusion of framework that would enable the granting of a compulsory license on mRNA, on technology, on medical technology, for instance. So despite the fact that the use of a compulsory license is still very, very important mechanism to use, but because of the requirements of listing, it might hinder the impact of full use. And therefore, it also would be very important, in addition to that, that in SA we have mechanisms that will allow for an application by a third party to file for considerations of a compulsory license without going through the course, because currently our process actually it's quite hefty and requires us to go through the court, and there isn't any administrative procedure which could be easy to use when filing for a compulsory license. But also in the case that there hasn't also been any government use or any sort of use of compulsory license by the government, and having, I think, legal mechanism to ensure that third parties like CSO patient groups are able to push the government to make use of compulsory license would still be important. So in light of the current process of reforming our patent laws in South Africa, I think it is important that we bear such considerations of considerations of like such limitations on technology in mind, and to address barriers and uncertainties caused by IP on life-saving medical. It would be important for government to consider all policy options and make use of legislative frameworks that would prioritize the full use of TRIPS flexibilities, which include creating effective examination guidelines or regulations to govern the evaluation of technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Candice. I really appreciate this. And as you can tell, the context is complicated. I think it's going to get even more complicated now, because our next participant, our next speaker is Nirmala Shyam, who is the Senior Program Officer in Health, Intellectual Property, and the Biodiversity Program at the South Center, who's going to give us a more international perspective across developing countries. So welcome, Nirmala.
Thanks, Achal. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me replying?
Hello?
Yes,
We
Nirmala.
just get to
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was not sure because I couldn't, suddenly everything had become muted. Thank you. Thank you to the Third World Network and the AccessIBSA Foundation as well for organizing this very important webinar and inviting us, the South Center, to this event. The research findings that have been presented today indeed are very topical for the work that we at the South Center have been doing in assisting IP offices in developing countries, in making full use of the TRIPS flexibilities through the examination of pharmaceutical patent applications from a public health perspective. Indeed, in a number of our national and regional trainings across the developing world, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, patent offices have expressed the need for more deliberation on how to examine patent applications specifically relating to biologics. So this is a need that the examiners are also feeling with the rising number of applications. And it is indeed good to see that the report speaks to this challenge, to this important challenge. Recently, the South Center had organized an exchange dialogue. We have been doing that for the past couple of years between IP officers from developing countries to share their experiences, approaches, and challenges in terms of examination of biologic patent applications, and the lack of guidelines, the need to develop guidelines on examination of biologic patent applications was something that the participants had expressed unequivocally in these exchanges. However, the challenge that I think offices continue to face, and that is where we need to go next, is how to go about developing those guidelines, given the technical complexities involved. Now, most of the existing capacities, as already has been observed today, for patent examination on pharmaceuticals in developing countries are relating to small molecules. There is very limited resources, human and technical, for examination of biologics at the moment. And that is a challenge that offices will need to overcome, while there are other developments that I will come to later that could potentially impede this direction of travel. Indeed, this means that there is need to explore the fullest extent to which the TRIPS flexibilities can be utilized with regard to biologic patents. Now, in this context, I think the findings of this report, while they are specific to the Indian context, will be of relevance for other developing countries. An important finding, obviously, is that the patent estates for biologics tend to be dispersed across many technologies and subcategories, making it very hard to connect the different products and technologies that comprise the whole patent estate of a single biologic drug. Another important finding also is that the lack of classification codes for biologics and their technological paths makes it challenging for examiners to identify them. We've also heard a similar challenge from the presentation of Ana in the Brazilian context. Now, therefore, the suggestion in the report that making appropriate revisions to national classification codes as well as the IPC in WIPO will help drive, if these are implemented, will help drive a global identification exercise. Now, to advance this objective, I think two things could be done. One is in terms of IPC. It may be necessary for developing countries to introduce a specific agenda in this regard in perhaps the WIPO Standing Committee on the Law of Patents to share experiences on the development or revision of their national classification codes in respect of biologics, and explore how the necessary revisions in the IPC could be pursued in the IPC review working group, which is a specific body under the Strasbourg Agreement that meets to frequently review and update the IPC codes. And so far, nothing has been done in terms of biologics. Another important finding in the report is the need for clear guidelines on examination of patent applications on biologics. It has been observed that currently many patent offices rely on general biotech guidelines, which are insufficient. Given the diversity of the technologies that one is confronted with in this field, it is important, therefore, to have perhaps very specific guidelines on specific fields of technology. For example, have specific guidelines on MABs, specific guidelines on proteins, etc. Another important suggestion that also the report makes is that the guidelines need to be frequently updated. We've also heard this from Anna, that these guidelines would need to be frequently updated, and that obviously would be relevant for all other countries which have or are developing such guidelines. Another aspect of the report that in the context of Section 3D in the Indian patent law that it points out to are challenges with identifying new forms of known biologics, which have resulted in a number of claims on which an objection could have been raised, but were nevertheless allowed. Now, the inconsistent application of 3D, which is a provision specifically intended to restrict evergreening, could actually result in patent thickets creating entry barriers for biosimilars. We have seen this playing out in terms of litigation in the United States in a big way, with patent thickets being a big problem. Now, in this regard, the recommendation in the report to draw up a list of alternative forms of biologics and include such a list in the examination guidelines can be a useful tool to aid patent examiners in the consistent application of Section 3D, not only in the Indian context, but also the application of similar provisions in other countries that have introduced such a provision in their law or in their examination guidelines. Another aspect that has been mentioned in the report is the need to make use of the government use provisions and also go for a product-based or platform-based approach towards ensure that the law enables a product-based or a platform-based approach to compulsory licensing. Now, this is something that is very much possible within the scope of the TRIPS flexibilities. Article 31 of TRIPS does not prevent countries from adopting this approach. However, as we saw in the slide presentation from Anna, with the reference to Special 301, that there is a possibility, very much a likelihood, that once these initiatives are taken, there would be non-salubrious mentions of the countries taking such steps in Special 301 reports, and a similar approach that is also being currently considered by the EU. The other aspect, I think, that systemic challenge that we also need to be aware of is that while we're talking of the need to develop tools in terms of guidelines, classification systems, to aid examiners to do the examination. And this brings us back in a way to the South African context, where one of the challenges is currently there is the law does not facilitate examination at all, substantive examination at all. Many developing countries are facing the possibility of being pushed in that direction, even though the law allows for substantive examination. For example, one of the most important factors to sort of be wary about are the patent validation agreements that, for example, the European Patent Office has been concluding with a number of developing country patent offices, which would essentially mean that once a patent, let's say if this applies to a biologic, or a biologic drug has been granted in the EPO, the applicant would just go to the country that has concluded a validation agreement and ask for that patent being recognized. So the guidelines, the tools, etc., would not even kick in that context. So there are these structural challenges that one also would need to overcome, and one would hope that that developing countries would rise to this challenge and will be able to overcome them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmal. I'm so sorry that we've gone overboard by about 7 minutes. It's 5:38 in Bangalore right now. We'll take questions, please, from anyone who has them. If you can raise your hand. I think there's one question in the chat that's directed to Anna. If you have questions directed to a specific person, could you do that? Could you name that person, please? Sorry, can you hear me? Is it possible to hear me? Can you
Yes,
hear
Yeah.
me? Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, great. Sorry. So there's a question in the chat that Anna has answered. Is there anyone else among us here who has a question? If so, please raise your hand, and we'd be really happy to have you ask it. And just direct it towards whoever it is that you're asking the question to. While people figure out their questions and raise their hands, because I can't see any hands raised as yet, maybe I can just elaborate on a particular aspect of the compulsory licensing provisions. The government use provision in India and in South Africa, for instance, is untested. It doesn't list a requirement to have patent applications specified, which is why we assume that it can work for a product or for a platform. We don't know that, but it most likely will. We also find that compulsory licensing provisions in general have to be overhauled because they are unnecessarily restrictive. In India, it's only a manufacturer, for instance, who can file a compulsory licensing application. The same is true in South Africa. It's not feasible to allow that kind of power to be concentrated in so few hands. The responsibility and mechanisms to have these compulsory licenses put into place needs to be broadened. Even for government use, we feel that there are ways in which we can create a system by which we can petition the government to use government use and hold it responsible to provide an explanation as to why it doesn't, if it doesn't even after a petition is raised. And these are some of the ways in which I think compulsory licensing could be broadened, not just substantively in terms of including products and platforms, but also in terms of being open and accountable to the people in the country that it's based. Are there any questions from anybody? If not, we can move towards wrapping up. A video of this webinar will be available very soon, I think in about a week. The Third World Network, Gargeya, who I must thank, by the way, who organized everything behind the scenes, will have that up. Maybe we can wait a minute in case anybody wants to add anything on the panel. While we wait, please do so, and please feel free to contribute.
Maybe you can read out the existing questions if you would like to. There are
there are two existing questions. Sorry, there are two existing questions. I didn't see that. Okay, the first is
have been answered. You can.
Yeah. There's an anonymous attendee who says, as biologics are technically more complex when compared to chemical molecules, practically, what are the elements that are to be used in designing patent examination guidelines in India? Roshan, would you like to take a stab at that answer?
Yes, I mean, very quickly on, I mean, of course, it's more technically more complex and compared to small molecules, but we do have a pharmaceutical guideline.
Could you switch on your video?
Yes, okay. So we do have currently the pharmaceutical examination guidelines, which have been developed over the years by looking at patent application, which have various instances. Suppose, say, for example, section 3D on what are like new use or new forms of a known substance, how to find them. It was developed over the years while looking at different applications. We in our report have listed various examples on how these applications related to biologics were treated by the patent office and how those were examined. I mean, it, as I think I so has mentioned, that this is something which has to be done in an evolving manner by year. And once we start with a comprehensive guideline, for biologic, it should be developed year and year, because it's a developing technology and it can be developed over the years. So we may not have the perfect guideline at the first place, but over the years we can strive to have a guideline which looks at this technology very comprehensively. Yeah.
Thanks, Roshan. I'll just rush on to try to finish in a couple of minutes. The next question is from Preeti Patnaik from the Geneva Health Files, who many of you will know. Preeti asks, how can this report inform the current negotiations on a pandemic agreement or amendments to the IHR? And what specific provisions would the authors like to see being discussed? Maybe, Gopa, this is a question for you because you're among us the one who is most involved in the negotiations in Geneva. And perhaps after you answer that, you can close the session because I think there aren't any other questions right now.
Can you just repeat the question once again? I'm trying to read it.
Sorry, it's in the report, so it's in the Q&A. You can see it. I'll just repeat. Yeah.
I think I got it. So I think it does help.
And maybe switch on your camera. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it does help. There are proposals from the Africa group in the IHR context as well as in the INB context to share the regulatory dossiers. This is very important. This report also, part of the report is dealing with the trade secret part, which we will have a follow-up webinar on that. So that's one part which is already placed by the countries. And the second part, when it comes to the patent part, there are a proposal to make use of the flexibilities. This is there in the INB as well as in the IHR context. So that basically means that if you operationalize the flexibilities available in the TRIPS agreement in the context of biotherapeutics as well as vaccines, many of the patents can be rejected, actually, which otherwise granted nowadays can be rejected. So then the patent monopolies can be brought down. So that's where you can reduce the challenges emanating from this kind of widespread patenting can be avoided, or the patent fencing, you may call it, or a patent thicket can be definitely avoided. So that is what Anna and Ramya told about. Ramya mentioned the example of Humira, which has like 300 patents or something around it. And Anna told that even though the original patent expired around 2011 in US, but the patents will, as of now, the patents will expire only in 2035 because of the multiple patents on the same part of the technology or same part of the product. So I would say that this report really informs, and and some of these findings can be used as a kind of a background information or a rationale for such proposals in the IHR and pandemic instrument treaty negotiation context.
Thanks, Gopal. That's really helpful. As Gopal was saying, I think that we have those flexibilities, as Nirmalya mentioned, the kinds of suggestions that we've made here in terms of changes of the law, those are all easily available to developing countries. And I think to the extent that the pandemic treaty negotiations or the IHR amendments allow for the full use of those TRIPS flexibilities in the manner that we've described here without retaliation or blowback, that would be super helpful. On behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to every one of you who came. We really appreciate you being here. Contact us separately if you have any follow-up questions. Goodbye, and thank you for being here.